This week we focus on the contemporary significance of the legal materials of the Pentateuch. You've done reading on the Holiness Code, and we now begin to put some of that into practice. I've decided to offer a case study this week. That is, how the Bible is used in contemporary discussions about same-sex relations, and particularly how the book of Leviticus is used. I want to clarify that my intention is not to convince you of a particular stance on sexual ethics, homosexuality, or even the authority of the Bible. It is my goal, however, to ask you to think about how what you are learning about the Bible may be relevant to these discussions. That as the Bible is used in these conversations, how can we talk well and honestly and responsibly about the Bible? Here's the way the question is usually posed. What does the Bible say about homosexuality? And the way the answer is usually offered is to quote one of 7 passages, infamously called the clobber passages in the gay and lesbian community, for obvious reasons. These include Genesis 19, the Sodom and Gomorrah story, 2 passages from Leviticus, 1 from Deuteronomy that is translated as referring to a sodomite in the King James Version, and then 4 passages from the New Testament. 3 of these include a particular set of words within a list of vices. It is Romans that actually is most important for New Testament discussions because it talks about shameless acts with men and women giving up unnatural passions. It is true that 2 other passages are invoked in this conversation as well, one of which you have studied quite extensively this semester, Genesis 1 through 2. The usual understanding is that these passages show us the creation order. They show us that God has intended male and female to come together to procreate. As the saying goes, it tells us about Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Mark 10, in which Jesus talks about divorce, is invoked as well because in that passage, Jesus refers back to Genesis chapter 2, apparently agreeing with Genesis about the male-female pair. We ask what the Bible says about homosexuality, we get the passages. The assumption about what we do with that is something like this. The Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it. That's the logic that we can find running throughout many of these discussions, including some of the infamous protests that use placards like this. Some of you may know about the Westboro Baptist Church, whose members picket the funerals of service members, arguing that these deaths are the sign of God's punishment on America for failing to stamp out homosexuality and other sins. But this kind of thinking is not limited to the Westboro Church. You'll see that a placard like this assumes that we know what God intends because we have a particular passage to prove it. God hates facts. Our question about this assumption, that the Bible says it, is to ask, what do these passages really say? And the first layer that we want to look at is the layer of translation. If you looked up what the Bible says about homosexuals or homosexuality and did an English word search, you'd find that it really doesn't say anything. At least not in the King James, where those words show up 0 times, or the New Revised Standard Version, same number, 0. One of those words does show up 1 time in the NIV and 4 times in the New Living Translation. What that tells us is that those words don't show up very frequently in any English translation, and they don't show up at all in some. The frequency depends on the translation. What about Leviticus 18:22, our case study for this week? In the New RSV, it says, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination." Seems fairly clear except let's look at other translations. Take a minute to compare the King James, the New International, the New Jerusalem, the Tanakh, the Jewish translation of the Tanakh, and the New Living Translation. Stop the video for a few minutes, do some comparisons, and then come back. What I see in the comparisons is that while they have similar ideas, there are some important distinctions. For example, the New Living Translation, "do not practice homosexuality," sounds different to me than the New Jerusalem, "do not have intercourse with." Not to be offensive to you, but you may be aware that not all homosexuals or not all heterosexuals restrict their sexual activities to intercourse. Does this law only rule out intercourse, or does it rule out kissing, hugging, and other forms of sexual intimacy? Compare to what's wrong with this activity. Is it an abomination? Is it detestable? Is it hateful? Is it abhorrent? Is it detestable? And if it's hateful, to whom is it hateful? Is it hateful to God? Is it hateful to the community? All these translations suggest that something's wrong, but why they're wrong gives me, or they sound a little different to me about what's wrong. Is it morally wrong, or is it just yucky from a human standpoint? Which is, quite frankly, the way I hear some people today talk about the issue. They call it the ick factor. I hope it would be clear to you that to understand this word more carefully, we cannot go to an English dictionary. After all, the problem is that we have different English translations, so looking up any one of them won't tell us anything. Instead, what we would need to do is to go back to the Hebrew word. What's in the Hebrew text that these different translators have attempted to put into English and done so in different ways? Those of you who know Hebrew can follow along with this and join in on the fun. The Hebrew word that is translated abhorrent, detestable, hateful, or abomination is the same Hebrew word. It is called to'evah. Here I've given the English transliteration of that as well as the Hebrew characters. Again, in order to understand this word, I'd have to go do a concordant search on the Hebrew word to find out what else in the Hebrew Bible is called a to'evah. I did that. I found that Leviticus, here in this chapter, other things are called to'evah. In verses 26, 27, 29, 30, several actions are generically lumped together and talked about as all these abominations. In order to understand to what they refer, I'd have to go and argue through which things are being talked about. Is it everything that's come before, just the things in that chapter, or what all is it referring to? We'll move on, though, to the fact that this word also shows up in Deuteronomy twice. In Deuteronomy 7, images of God are to be burned, and a person is not supposed to covet the silver or gold because that would be abhorrent. Now again, it's not the word abomination, but it is the Hebrew word to'evah, which is being translated in this case into the New RSV as abhorrent. Same thing with Deuteronomy 14. It's the Hebrew word to'evah, which is being translated in different ways in different English translations. In Deuteronomy 7, a to'evah is coveting silver and gold. In Deuteronomy 14, a to'evah is eating the wrong kinds of foods. What I conclude from this is that to'evah isn't always used for things that are morally repugnant, at least in my own understanding. For example, Deuteronomy 14, the eating of improper foods is understood to be just as bad, or at least it's the same word that's being used here that is used for same-sex relations in Leviticus. If we want to know what the Bible actually says, then we'd probably need to go and learn some Hebrew to figure out what's behind the English translations and what those words actually mean. Another layer we can add to this conversation of what do the passages actually say is to use a skill that you've learned how to use, and that is external structure. Does knowing what else is around this passage affect your understanding of its meaning? As you know from your reading this week, our passage, 18:22, comes in a section of Leviticus called the Holiness Code. You can review it for yourself, what all is there. I've given my own summary of what's in Leviticus 17 through 26. You'll remember that it includes sacrifices, restrictions on sex with people in your extended family, with a menstruating woman, other men, that's where our passage comes in, with animals, and that the sex restrictions are actually interrupted to talk about offering your child as a sacrifice to another god. Chapter 19, which follows our chapter, deals with don't steal, don't lie. It tells us to love our neighbor as ourselves, but that's immediately followed by not interbreeding animals, sowing a field with two kinds of seeds, or wearing clothes made of different kinds of materials. It regulates but does not forbid sex with another man's slave, and it outlaws tattoos. Chapter 20 gives us more sexual restrictions and tells us that if a woman has sex with an animal, both the animal and the woman should be put to death. Here, as in Deuteronomy that we saw before, unfit foods make you detestable. Chapters 21 through 22 talk about purity rules for priests. Priests can have no blemishes, mutilations, or broken bones. The Holiness Code finishes out by talking about festivals, rituals in the temple, and the sabbatical and jubilee years. It does let us know that you cannot charge interest on a fellow Israelite to whom you give a loan. As you know again from your reading, the Holiness Code does not come to us alone. It has been integrated with the book of Leviticus. That is, Leviticus 1 through 16, the material from the Peace Source, has either added the Holiness Code into it, or the Holiness Code was added later, so that in the final form of the book of Leviticus, we have a much bigger package. You remember this from last week. Leviticus starts out talking about sacrifices, moves to the consecration of priests, then to laws regarding clean and unclean, which include menstruating women, various types of bodily emissions, including the restriction of semen within sexual relationships between a man and a woman, as well as different kinds of food. That's followed by a ceremony for the Day of Atonement. Then we get the Holiness Code, and finally we hear about the religious vows. That is, Leviticus 18 through 22 is part of a larger package of rules in Leviticus that are intended to regulate the holiness and cleanness of ancient Israel. There's a lot in these chapters that includes a wide range of activities. It's time then to do some thinking for yourself. Do the Holiness Code or Leviticus make any distinctions between these kinds of laws? That is, does it make a distinction between the ritual and the moral? Does it make distinctions between which are intended to be universal for all people, all times, all places, and which were limited to ancient Israel? As you look at the laws, consider whether you or the people you know treat all of Leviticus in the same way. And if the answer is no, why not? Is that based on anything about Leviticus? Is that actually what the passage says?